Hello everybody, welcome to my video analysis on Tumor by Joshua Hale Fialkov and Noel Toison. Video was made by Logan Williams, yours truly. Let's get into it. Let's start off with the fun stuff. The total page count of the graphic novel came out to 202 pages long. The hardcover copy, however, does have 237 pages. This is due in part thanks to the introduction at the beginning, followed by the graphic novel, which was then followed up by a short story written in generic prose about the early stages of Frank Armstrong titled B&E. That got followed up with a interview, and then at the very end they threw in some fun sketches from the original storyboards. It was published by Archaea Entertainment in 2010, which did follow a digital release on Kindle in 2009, in which Tumor was released as 8 separate chapters, or issues, if you will. Let's take a look at the story structure. As I previously mentioned, Tumor was released as 8 separate chapters or issues, but when it got put on to physical, it was compiled into one graphic novel. It does follow the 3-act structure, where Act 1 ends at the Chapter 2, Act 2 starts at the beginning of Chapter 3. Now Act 2 ends, however, on page 140, which is in the middle of a chapter, and then it will last until the end of the story on page 202. Now, this is Frank's story, and I can't emphasize that enough. Throughout Tumor's runtime, we'll meet a couple extra characters, most prevalent being Evie or Evelyn, but at the end of the day, the story's all about Frank and his growth, if you will. Now, let's take a look at the basic overview of the story for those who might be unfamiliar. Tumor follows Frank Armstrong, who is a now elderly, retired, hard-boiled PI who has been diagnosed with a terminal tumor. It is inoperable, and that's what the doctor tells him. Rather than just taking it lightly and waiting around for his final days to meet him, Frank decides to accept one final job. Now, we don't know just yet, but it does get revealed to us that when it mattered most, and what led to him retiring, was the fact that Frank couldn't save the girl when it mattered most. And now with the opportunity for this one final job, this could be the time he could finally save the girl. Finally be the good guy. So he accepts the job offer and takes on this one last job, and that is what sets us off on the story that would proceed. Now, I don't want to spoil too much in this analysis, but because it is an analysis, some spoilers are inevitable. Early on, it does bring up how time is fluid, and it really plays with this idea as it jumps between current and past versions of Frank. And I'll show what I mean by that as we get on to this next slide, which is going to be into our transitions. As I was going through the story, I found the majority of the transitions to be subject to subject, which isn't a case just in Tumor. I find that to be the case in most graphic novels I've looked at and have read throughout the month. I found the second most prevalent transition to be action to action, which, again, it's not really a shocker, especially seeing as how this is a crime noir thriller. That being said, however, on page 87, which is the image you can all see, I found there to be a really powerful non sequitur. If we take a gander at the top of the page, you can tell that it's a nice, beautiful landscape. As you look down once, you can tell, oh, wait a minute, now it's all urbanized. Take a look at the final of the three, and you get a nice touch at some, or a nice view at some beautiful oranges, which is what California, which is the state that we are looking at in this image, or in this page, was once a lead producer of. Frank grew up in California, and he's recalling this time as he is riding on the subway, sitting next to Evelyn. Now, Evelyn, who's sitting on the right of him, throughout the story, she is seen from Frank's perspective as being Rosa, who was his previous wife, the girl in question that he could not save when it mattered most. Now, throughout the story, like I just said, Frank views Evelyn as Rosa quite a bit. His brain is playing tricks on him because they look extremely similar. Now, if you take a look at the next slide where I show some examples of the transitions, you can get a better view of what I mean by that, and I'll explain a little bit more as well. So if we start on the left, we can see the moment to moment. Now, on this page, you can tell that Evelyn is walking out of the door in the top left, and Frank is sitting on the little bed, or the stretcher. He is attempting to get up before realizing that, hey, look, he's suffering an injury. And so that brain tumor is giving him a massive ringing headache, and I thought that Noel Toison did an extremely effective job at showing the effects of the ringing. As you can tell, all the circles that he drew, none of them are symmetrical. They're all very abstract and different. Because when you have a pounding headache, you can't see things as one way. It kind of all just mashes together. Now, for the middle page, which was subject to subject, you can tell that in each panel the subject does change. And how I mentioned earlier where the whole time is fluid concept and how the art really displays that. On the bottom of this page in the middle, you can see Frank on the left, which is current day. It's very coarse, it's very rough. The image isn't smooth, it isn't clean. Compared to on the right, which was a very younger Frank. And on this, you can tell that it looks like it's almost painted rather than drawn in with pen like on the left. It's a lot softer. It's still nowhere near clean, because that's just not who Frank is. It's not the type of story that the authors and artists were setting out to tell. It's a rough and gruff and grim story. And the artwork does a great job of portraying that. And so whenever he'd see or view Evelyn as Rosa, you can tell that because the artwork would swap over to the more kind of painted look compared to the drawn in look. Now on the right, our final image, the action to action. On these 6 panels, you can tell that a conversation is being had. We have our 3 characters here as they're going through it, and then Evelyn eventually leaves, and the conversation continues. It is one scene, but it shows an effective transition throughout it. Now, I did find a very, very useful case of aspect to aspect transition, at least according to McLeod's theory of what transitions are. And that will be on the next slide. Now, the best use of aspect to aspect I found was on pages 172 and 173. If we take a look at the top left, or the top of page 172, you can tell that our main character, Frank, is hunched over or lying over in the back seat of a car. And the panel just below that, Frank is still our main focus. Everything else is now looking extremely abstract. It's getting pulled and twisted and bent as if it was being pushed away from him. Or ripped away from him, I should say. In the very bottom of page 172, not even in a panel, you can see Frank. The same Frank, still curled over, still just there. Nothing else around him this time. Now, if we follow that over to page 173, notice you can tell where their panels should be, but there's no boxing. There's no brackets around them. They do this to show that the aspect is swapped. It's now no longer Frank is now no longer in the real world. Frank is now in his own world. And I thought this was an extremely use of visual storytelling, or extremely useful use of visual storytelling. And I, again, cannot praise the artwork enough here. I thought it was absolutely fantastic in showing the effects that a tumor can have on the human psyche. Because again, if we notice on page 173, look how Frank is drawn. It's the current era. It's the current day. It's in pen. It's very gruff, very rough. Compared to who he sees Rosa, and even at the very bottom where he sees his past self. Notice how it's drawn. It's different, and that's such a good way of swapping the aspect. I can't help but sing this story's praise enough. Next up, we have the artistic flow. Now, I know normally we'd start on the left and work to the right, but let's start on the right image first, as I think this is an excellent example of the artwork pulling you through the story. If you notice in the top left panel, Frank is sitting there talking to another detective. It starts dark around his shirt, and the darkness continues on to the sleeve of the other detective. If you notice, the shadow right below that is pulling your eyes down all the way over to Frank, who's now sitting opposite of him on the left. As he stands up to walk outside, you can tell that it's just a silhouette that's talking, and it's all blacked out. Again, keeping your eyes pulling down. Cut that to the side where you have both the other detective and Frank standing in the doorway. It is, again, just those two are dark and everything else is white. If you take a second, pause the video, and analyze the actual image you're looking at, you can notice it makes that Z pattern that our professor was telling us about during the lecture for the lettering assignment. And I found that was very insightful, especially in here, where you can physically tell or literally see where the Z would be. And on the left, for the artistic flow, I thought this was a great use of pulling us through the image. If you notice, this story does extreme use of playing on heavy black and very light white. Not a lot of grays unless it's needed. It's a great contrast. And so if we look in the middle of the page, we have Frank reaching his arm out to push down the gun. Now, if you notice, his sleeve is all the way black, and then the image kind of is just scratched out behind him. And opposite of him is some very beautiful white arms, completely opposite the entire abstract. That's going to catch your eye. It's going to want you to keep flowing that way. And then again, that bright white is continued on onto the panel to the right of it. And below that, the cherry on top, is where do your eyes want to look when you see a wall of text and a bright black silhouette? You're going to want to look right at that bright black silhouette. And then as you're noticing it, you then take the second to realize, wait, this is what Frank is happening in his mind. He is feeling this. And the artistic expression on display here, I thought, was absolutely phenomenal. Now, lastly, let's move on to our last slide. And with that, we reach the end of the discussion. And with that, we've reached the end of our presentation.